Welcome to the Remote Testing Training module. This module will walk you through information and administration features of remote testing. This module will provide information on the following topics: an overview of remote administration and its testing window, student eligibility for remote testing and participation, parent-guardian consent requirements for remote testing, remote testing administration guidance, an overview of remote testing and the infrastructure of the platform, preparing your computer and other technology such as responsibilities and expectations, accessing the Remote Testing Administration Certification course, and finally a checklist and contact information for technical support. Let's start with an overview of remote administration and the testing window. First, districts and schools are required under ESSA and Division 22 to administer the Oregon Statewide Summative Assessment. This information provides data to help families, schools, districts, and the state understand student academic achievement and provides signals to monitor the systems at the local level and throughout Oregon to evaluate how the Oregon education system is functioning.
The remote testing window will open on different dates based on the specific content areas and grade levels. The high school OSAS remote test window for ELA, math, and science will open earlier than other tests or surveys. This window will open February 6th and close on June 14th. The English Language Proficiency Assessment, or ELPA, is administered to students kindergarten through 12th grade who are receiving English Learner Services and has a test window of March 5th through April 12th. You will notice the ELPA window is much shorter than the other windows. It is necessary to have all ELPA results completed by April 12th to allow for scoring and reporting to districts by the end of the academic calendar, and to allow districts and schools to make decisions on future English Learner Services. Therefore, districts and schools should prioritize remote administration of ELPA before students begin other Oregon summative assessments or surveys. Both the OSAS Science Test and the SEED survey will also open on March 5th, but they will close on June 14th. And finally, the OSAS English Language Arts and Mathematics Test for students in grade 3 through 8 will open on April 2nd and close on June 14th.
This next section will discuss which students are eligible to participate in remote testing.
Most students across Oregon will test in person. Students whose primary instruction model was in person will participate in the Oregon Summative Assessments in person as aligned to their school's instruction model. Students who participate remote or in online instruction may be offered the opportunity to participate in summative assessments remotely. In certain circumstances, the districts or schools might have students participate in in-person testing, even if they receive their instruction remotely or online. We will explain those scenarios in the next slide. Some districts and schools might need to make alternate in-person testing opportunities for students participating in a remote or online instructional model, such as if a school has technology limitations for the TA or the student, such as limited broadband, hardware requirements, or assistive technology. Or if a school identifies accessibility needs that cannot be supported, such as designated or accommodation supports. And finally, if a student is participating in either of the Oregon Extended Assessment or the alternate ELPA, or any Oregon statewide assessment presented in a Braille version. In these scenarios, they will not be able to provide remote testing and will need to work with the student and family to schedule the test at an alternate location, such as a district office or an alternate school site.
The following section describes the parent-guardian consent requirements for remote testing. Consent is required for a student to participate in a remotely proctored test session. The Oregon Department of Education has provided a consent form districts should use to get written verification of consent. Please check with your district on communication and the district's process for gaining parent-guardian permission. Even if a student is receiving their instruction remotely or online, a parent has the right to request in-person testing for their child. The Parent-Guardian Remote Test Administration Agreement form has two checkboxes to indicate the preference for their child participating in the Oregon Summative Assessments. Either my child will or my child will not participate in remote testing. Additionally, the form indicates whether the student will utilize their webcam and thus have video and audio enabled, audio only, or no video or audio enabled. Student participation in remote testing does not require that a student video or audio is enabled during the test session. However, it is important to note and communicate to families that the only form of two-way communication without the video and audio or audio only enabled is an embedded chat feature within the remote testing platform, and therefore technical support may be limited. The next section will talk about the TIDE settings for remote testing. Permissions must be set in TIDE to allow a student to participate in remote administration. TIDE also indicates if the video permission has been obtained from the parent or guardian and must also be set in the TIDE remote test settings. If a parent or guardian provides consent, the permissions must be set in TIDE to yes in the remote tester setting at the student level. In some cases, if there are large numbers of students participating in remote testing, a DTC, STC, or TA might want to utilize a batch upload to the TIDE system. Please refer to the TIDE user guide for more information on batch uploads. Please note that all students in TIDE will have the remote tester radio buttons. It is not necessary to change this setting for all students. If no bubble has been selected in TIDE, the system will automatically default to no. Again, the radio button must be selected yes for the remote testing functionality to work for summative assessments and the SEED survey or even the Oregon interim assessments. If the parent has granted permission for their child to have video or audio enabled during remote testing, the DTC, STC, or TA will need to indicate the preferences within TIDE. Similar to the remote test setting, if no drop-down has been selected in TIDE, the system will automatically default to no video or audio enabled. However, DTCs, STCs, or TAs should verify this TIDE setting is accurately set prior to remote administration based on the information contained in the Parent-Guardian Remote Testing Administration Agreement form. In the following section, we will provide some general guidance on remote test administration and distinguish differences for remote testing using the OSAS Secure Browser. Based on the assessment or survey within the Oregon statewide assessment system, there are two pathways for remote administration. Primarily, users will use the first, which is the OSAS Secure Browser. This is the same secure browser students use to access the Oregon Summative Assessment in person. The OSAS Secure Browser can be downloaded to electronic devices by visiting the OSAS portal at www.osasportal.org and downloading the secure browser based on the electronic device's operating system. The second pathway is using a remote student testing web link within the Test Administrator Session Manager. Specifics about creating a remote student testing web link is covered in a remote testing certification course, which is required for TAs managing remote testing. We will discuss which assessments or surveys will use which pathway for remote testing in the next few slides. All Oregon statewide summative assessments are required to be administered using the OSAS Secure Browser, such as ELPA, the OSAS ELA, Math, and Science summative assessments. The SEED survey and Oregon interim assessments can be administered remotely using the OSAS Secure Browser, but it is not a requirement. As previously mentioned, when a TA is creating a test session within the OSAS portal, they will be able to schedule a remote testing session. This allows the user to obtain a remote student testing web link, which can then be shared with students who do not have the secure browser loaded on their device. The remote testing certification course required for remote administration will provide further guidance for creating a remote student testing web link. The SEED survey and Oregon interim assessments are the only two components that can be administered remotely using a remote student testing web link. The Oregon statewide summative assessments cannot be administered using the remote student testing site, and again must be administered using the OSAS Secure Browser only. Once again, these include the ELPA, the OSAS ELA, Math, and Science summative assessments. If a district is unable to load a secure browser on the student's device, they will need to arrange an alternate in-person opportunity for those Oregon statewide summative assessments. It is recommended that a TA test no more than 5 students at a time during one active remote session. This will allow a TA to be able to remotely support students experiencing any testing or technical difficulties quickly and avoid disrupting students. ODE will continue to monitor district school needs and adjust recommendations accordingly. TAs will be able to communicate with students based on the parent-guardian consent form and how the student settings have been recorded in TIDE. Again, the parent must allow for use of video, audio, or audio only. If neither of these options have been allowed, the TA will need to utilize the chat platform as its sole communication resource. The group chat feature is also another tool a TA can use for communicating with all students who are participating in a remote testing session. The remote testing certification course required for remote administration will provide further directions on how to use these tools in the remote testing platform. Once a student begins a remote test, they must complete that test in its entirety in the remote format. If a student changes their location and tests at an in-person site, they will still need a remote testing session to complete their remote test started. For instance, if a student begins their OSAS Science assessment in a remote testing session, they will need to have the TA create a remote session ID so that they can complete their OSAS Science assessment, which started remotely. It is also important to note that unlike the in-person ELPA, the remote version of the ELPA is broken out by each domain, in which each of these testing instances appear as a separate test, with the student needing to log back into the system to complete each domain. For example, if a student starts the ELPA reading domain, they will complete all components of the ELPA reading domain and press End Test. They will then need to once again log back into the remote testing platform and select the next ELPA domain, Writing, and be approved by the TA to begin this domain of the ELPA. The same will be true for starting the listening domain and the speaking domain. It is the responsibility of the district or school to ensure that all students have the appropriate accessibility supports in place during remote test administration. This includes accommodations within an IEP or a 504. As a reminder, if supports, including assistive technology, cannot be provided remotely, a district should work with the family for in-person testing options. Just as with in-person testing, the Oregon Accessibility Manual, or OAM, applies to remote testing. For Oregon statewide assessments, districts and schools may only make available to students the universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations that are included in the OAM. Just as with in-person testing, test administrators are also responsible for monitoring testing improprieties. Improprieties are behaviors prohibited during test administration. If a test administrator has observed or identified a testing impropriety based on the actions of a student or their family member, they are to follow the same guidance that is included in the Test Administrator Manual. The Parent-Guardian Remote Test Administration Agreement Form, signed by the parent or guardian, includes information about testing improprieties on the back of the form. There is both a parent and student agreement that outlines appropriate behavior and unacceptable behavior during remote testing. The following section provides a brief overview of the remote testing platform infrastructure, TIDE, and technical communication. The remote testing certification course required by test administrators administering remote test sessions will provide more training and information about the functionality of the remote testing platform. The OSAS online testing system has been upgraded to allow proctors to administer tests to students who are remote and not at a school. No additional software is needed for test administrators to enable the remote testing capabilities for remote sessions. However, TAs will need to complete and pass the remote testing certification course. Once a TA has completed this requirement, the remote proctoring setting will be automatically activated in the TA's TIDE account. Again, it is important to complete the remote testing certification course prior to trying to start a remote testing session. Proctors will log into the same test administration site they would use if students were testing at school. From this site, proctors can select a remote test session or an in-person session. Proctors can also schedule sessions in advance and provide a link for students to join the session when it starts. This functionality is covered in the remote testing certification course. Remote students should use the secure browser to access the same testing website they would access in school, and the test takes place the same way it would if everyone were together in the classroom. If the secure browser is not already installed on a student's device, and if it is not possible to install the secure browser on a student's device, districts or schools should work with the families to arrange for in-person testing. The secure browser is required to remotely participate in the ELPA and the OSAS ELA, Math, and Science assessments. Since the infrastructure of the remote testing platform operates in the same manner as the in-person testing system, TAs will need to ensure students have their SSID numbers for logging into a remote testing session and the remote testing session ID number. Additionally, TAs should share information about the test date and time and communicate what supports have been activated based on the student's needs and allowable supports included in the OAM. Please note, the Test Administration Manual has more information about how to share secure information remotely. Since all Oregon statewide summative assessments must be administered using the OSAS Secure Browser, if not already installed, districts need to install the Secure Browser or facilitate a family installation. Test administrators. We use the same testing platform for remote administration in the OSAS portal that is used for in-person administration. There will be a radio button to indicate whether the testing session is in person or if it is a remote session. Please note, even if a test administrator selects the remote radio button for summative assessments or the SEED survey, they will not have access until the system has been enabled and that the remote system has operational capabilities. Again, parents or guardians must allow permission for a student to enable their video and/or audio. These settings must be updated at the student level in TIDE prior to the student participating in remote administration. In addition to video audio tools, TAs can use the chat, broadcast, and screen sharing features. Note, screen share is not available on Apple Mac or iPad devices. These features are all covered in the Remote Testing Certification course posted on the OSAS portal. The next few slides explore responsibilities and expectations for administering assessments or surveys remotely. We will briefly cover some actions and considerations for before, during, and after testing. The technology requirements to administer assessments remotely are almost exactly the same as those used for testing done in a classroom, except proctors and students will generally need access to a webcam, microphone, and speakers. Before administering a remote test session, TAs should ensure that they and their students have the necessary hardware and that it is functioning properly. For TAs, you would check to make sure your computer or iPad has a conventional web browser installed so you can access the OSAS portal test administration site. Additionally, your computer should have a built-in or plug-in webcam, microphone, and speakers for communicating with students during a remote test administration session. If necessary, a TA can practice logging into a remote testing session by accessing the TA practice site. This will allow both the TA and the student to test that hardware is operating appropriately and confirm that all settings have been updated in TIDE. Since the technology requirements to administering assessments remotely are similar, before administering a remote test session, ensure your students have the necessary hardware and that it is functioning properly. For instance, each remote student's testing device has the secure browser installed so they can access the testing interface. And each remote student's testing device has a built-in or plug-in webcam, microphone, and speaker. And again, this is required only for students whose families have approved the use of remote video and audio. As a reminder, use of a student camera requires parent and guardian consent. As mentioned on the previous slides, students are also able to log into a sample test and practice using the remote testing features such as video, chat, and screen share. Students who use assistive technologies during a test, when that test takes place at a school, need access to the same assistive technologies when they take a test remotely. District technology coordinators should work with families who are remote testing to set up any necessary assistive technologies. If access to necessary technologies cannot be provided to students at home, districts should work with their families to determine other options for taking the test. The following table provides some actions that occur before testing. In addition to completing this training module, any educator that is planning to proctor a remote testing session must also complete the remote testing certification course to have their TA Tide account activated for remote testing. It is also important to share test information with families and students, such as testing dates, SSID numbers, and the session ID number for remote testing when it is taking place for the summative assessments. The remote testing platform provides two-way communication once students have logged into their test. However, this two-way communication is not active until a student has fully completed the login process. Therefore, any communication required prior to testing, such as test directions, should be communicated using the Local Learning Management System, or LMS, such as Zoom, Google Classroom, or other systems. Reviewing the student directions is important prior to testing to ensure students are familiar with the assessment and they have logged into the correct assessment and session. Though a student cannot have another application running while they are in the secure browser, the TA can have an active session and the LMS running in the background simultaneously in case a student or family is having login difficulties and needs technical support. Again, the student will have to close out of all applications before launching the secure browser. During the test, remote TAs will primarily spend their time monitoring student progress through the test session platform. The TA should monitor any student who has activated the hand raised feature. This feature will be covered during the remote testing certification course. After testing, the remote TAs will communicate the status of a student's testing progress with families and communicate any additional feedback about the remote testing experience to either the school testing coordinator or district testing coordinator to inform future enhancements to the remote testing system. Throughout this training, the Remote Test Administration certification course has been referenced as a requirement for remote testing and for additional information. This next section will discuss how to access the course. To administer tests to students who are remote, TAs must complete and pass the Remote Test Administration certification course. This course is only required for those TAs that will be administering the remote testing session. The course will walk you through how to administer remote assessments to students and can be accessed via the OSAS portal under the Test Administrators tab. The Remote Test Administration certification course explains many topics such as preparing your computer before testing, accessing the remote proctoring test administration site, scheduling a remote test session, communicating remote test session information to remote students, how to join and begin a remote test session, communicating with and assisting remote students during a test session, and finally, how to pause and or stop a remote test session. The last section will provide a quick checklist for remote testing and contact information for technical support. The following list provides a quick checklist to complete before a remote test session. 1. Verify the parent and or guardian has completed and returned the ODE Parent-Guardian Remote Test Administration Agreement form or permission using the process your DTC has provided to obtain consent. 2. Both parental consent for remote testing and/or video attributes have been set in the student tied settings. 3. All student test settings and tools have been set in tied. 4. TAs have taken and passed remote TA certification courses required for remote administration. 5. Diagnostic checks have been completed and verified for both TAs and student machines. And finally, 6. Test session date and times have been sent with students' information and parents, and all login information has been shared. Please refer to the following for contact information and technical support. If you need additional information or have questions, please contact your district testing coordinator or consult the resources posted on the ODE Test Administration website under the Remote Testing Resources section. For content-specific support or questions, please refer to the ODE Assessment Help webpage. If you need technical assistance for remote testing, you can contact the OSAS Help Desk by email or phone. This concludes Module 10, Remote Testing.